Right, good afternoon everybody. We'll make a start. Welcome to today's UCL Lunch Hour lecture. I'm Richard Pearson and it's my pleasure to very briefly introduce Tim Newbold. We've lost the connection. I'm sure that'll come back. So Tim is a Senior Research Associate in the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research here at UCL. He's been doing some really important work in the last few years, particularly focused on the impact of climate change and land use change on biodiversity and what that means for human societies. Tim did his undergraduate and PhD at Nottingham University and then did a 5-year postdoc at the World Conservation Monitoring Centre in Cambridge, but is now here at UCL, and we're very pleased to have him. And I think we're going to focus today on bumblebees. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Richard. So as Richard said, today I'm going to talk mostly about the work that we've been doing recently, looking at declines in bumblebees, and think a little bit about why that's happening, what's causing these declines, and why we should be concerned about those declines. So before I start with the talk, a few thank yous. Firstly, to the wonderful colleagues that work with me in the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research here at UCL. Also, several funding agencies for providing the money that's made this possible. And also some particular thanks for the bumblebee work that I'll present today, principally to the co-authors of the bumblebee work, Jeremy Kerr and Peter Sharoy in the University of Ottawa, but also to Andy Purvis at the Natural History Museum, and Richard, and also Henry Ferguson-Gow here at UCL. And also a big thank you. So, literally hundreds of people have contributed various pieces of data that have made the sorts of analyses that I'll show possible. So also, a big thank you to all of those people who have provided data. So I think most people in the room probably are familiar with the fact that biodiversity is in steep decline, and of course one thing that has been in the news relatively recently, so back in May of last year, when the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services produced its first big report, the authors of the report estimated that as many as 1 million species on the planet may be threatened with extinction. And the World Economic Forum, the meeting that took place a couple of weeks ago in Davos in Switzerland, they produce a report every year that identifies what they see as being the biggest risks that are faced by the planet and by human societies. And this year, for the first time, the World Economic Forum identified biodiversity loss as being one of those top 5 risks that we face as a human society. And we know that, biodiversity underpins pretty much all of the natural systems, on which we rely as human societies. And also, it also provides a set of more tangible, more direct benefits that are easier to understand. And these are things that we refer to as ecosystem services, things like pollination, cycling of nutrients, provision of fuel, and also, of course, for our culture and recreation, which is shown to be important for mental well-being. So it's been estimated that in 2008, when we had the banking crisis, that the cost of that to the world economy was, estimates vary, but generally these estimates are putting it somewhere around $498 billion, around $500 billion. So would anyone care to guess at the value of all of those things that nature provides to us, ecosystem services? Anyone hazard a guess at what they might be worth? trillion. Trillions, yes, trillions. So they're thought to be worth something in the region of $33 trillion every year. And for various reasons, this is probably quite a big underestimate. There are lots of things that we don't know about that biodiversity probably does for us, and we just don't even know it. And then just focusing in on one specific example, which will become relevant later. Pollination alone is thought to be worth something like $230 to $410 billion every year. So I guess that brings us on to bumblebees, and I'm just going to do a little experiment. So just by a show of hands, who here already thinks bumblebees are great? Okay, so that's pretty overwhelming. Does anyone think they're just a nuisance in the garden in the summer? No one's brave enough to vote for that option. Well, I've got a converted audience. That's nice. So the second part of the experiment, which I don't think we need anymore because you're already convinced, which is great. The second part of the experiment was to say, who likes one of the foods that are shown on this slide here? I'm predicting that will be pretty much everybody. Well, no one's showing their hands. So all of these food types, particularly things like nuts, fruits, squashes and melons, that kind of thing, bumblebees play an important role in pollinating all of these crops. So if you weren't convinced already, hopefully you are now that bumblebees are very important. They're not pollinating crops that give us a lot of our calories, but they are pollinating crops that give us a lot of variety in our diet. So those are the nice things that we like to eat. And it's also known that insects and bumblebees among them are also in steep decline. So also over the past couple of years, you've probably been aware of pieces of news coming out about insect declines. There's been a lot of research over the past few years showing very, very steep declines in insect populations. And so, my research really is about trying to understand declines of biodiversity, including of insects. And mostly I've been doing this through, trying to gather together the best data that we have from as many different parts of the world, building computer models and analyses that try and understand the changes that we're seeing and understand what's driving them, and then to use these computer models to make predictions about what might happen in the future, depending on how we continue from here. And today, I'm going to focus on some work that we've been doing on bumblebees, and particularly focusing on what's been happening in Europe. And one thing that we are, that's not like that. One thing that we're very lucky in Europe is that people have been collecting data for a long time. So this animation here is showing places where people have recorded bumblebees over the past 115 years. And what you can see is that there are changes over time in where people are recording, but we've got quite a lot of data that we can use to try and understand what's going on. And so what we've been doing recently, together with the collaborators that I mentioned in Ottawa, is to try and look at the changes in where bumblebees are found, and to try and understand what's driving those changes. And so we had a paper actually that came out at the end of last week, where we looked at changes across this 115 years, for which we have pretty good data in Europe. And what we found is that across Europe, between 1900 and the present day, that bumblebees have declined by around 20% across Europe. Actually, what we found in this same paper is that declines have been much larger in North America, and we're still not sure exactly what's driving the differences, but declines across both continents, and declines of around 20% across Europe, which is a pretty large decline. But I think, you know, what's most interesting to us in understanding these declines is trying to work out what's driving it, and then to think about what this might mean when we start to think about the future. So, of course, you know, during those 115 years, we've seen some pretty big changes in climate in Europe. So the video on the left here is showing changes in average temperatures across Europe, across the 115 years. What you see, of course, is that it changes a lot year on year. But as you get towards the more recent years, then you start to see a lot more red. And this is shown really nicely with these sorts of visualizations that have been produced by Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading. This is shown here for France, which is in the middle of our study area of Europe, where from left to right you've got years becoming more recent, and the red colours indicate hotter years and the blue colours cooler years. And of course what you can see very clearly here is that the most recent years have all been on average much hotter than earlier years. And something that we're interested when trying to understand changes in biodiversity is not only these sorts of changes in average temperatures, but perhaps more importantly, changes in extremes of temperature and extremes of climate, because these are really important for animals and plants. So just to give a couple of examples, then you probably remember in 2018, the UK suffered one of the worst droughts that it's seen for many years. And it was so dry even that, you know, you could see the browning of the land in satellite images. And of course, right now we're experiencing an extreme weather event right in the middle of Storm Kira. And we're interested in these things because they can be extremes of climate can be very important in determining what happens to animals and plants. So in this work that we had that came out last week, as well as documenting the declines that we've seen in bumblebees across Europe and also North America, we also looked at whether climate, and particularly whether extremes of climate, might be explaining the changes that we've seen. And so what we find if we do this is that climate change alone can help us to explain around 10% of the patterns that we see in changes in bumblebees over time. And this is pretty good for a study of ecology. You know, natural systems are very complicated. What the ways that animals and plants change and where we find them is determined by a great many things. And so as ecologists, we're normally pretty pleased if we see something like this. You know, if we're able to explain 10% of what's going on, that's pretty good. And if we isolate those effects of climate change and we predict what effect those alone have had on bumblebees, we predict that they've been responsible for around 8% decline in bumblebees across Europe. But of course, climate change isn't the only thing that has been happening. So also over the past centuries, we have drastically changed the way that we use the land. And so what you see, more orange and red areas are here, areas with a lot of farming and cities. And so what you see, of course, over the past few hundred years is that we've used more and more of our land for growing food and for cities to live. And we know when we look at biodiversity that typically we get less biodiversity in farmland. Actually, for bumblebees, the picture is more mixed. So well-managed farmland can actually be relatively good for bumblebees. But if we manage it intensively, if we apply a lot of chemicals and pesticides and things, then we know it's much worse for bumblebees. But what we find if we take this into account, if we add in the effects of changes in the way that we use land, that we get slightly better at explaining patterns in changes in bumblebees over the past 100 or so years. And if we isolate just the effects of climate but also changes in land use, then these together are predicted to have led to declines of around 9% over the 115 years of the study. But what we're really interested in is not just how climate change and changes in land use are impacting bumblebees, but particularly the interplay between these two things. And there are various reasons why we think that these two big threats to bumblebees might be playing off against one another. So the first is, in previous episodes of climate change, there have been episodes of rapid climate change in the history of the Earth. And at that time, species were able to, what we find with climate change, of course, is that species need to move to cooler areas. So they need to move towards the poles, and they need to move up mountainsides. And when climate change has happened in the past, species have been able to move through natural habitats. So that's much easier than what they're faced with today, which is moving through these sorts of landscapes where we've taken away a lot of the natural habitats and put in farmland, which is less good for biodiversity. And so this makes it harder for species to move with climate change. And on top of that is the fact that not only is it is farmland generally bad for biodiversity and makes it harder for species to move, but also farmlands and also cities, of course, are hotter and drier than natural habitats. So if you go and walk in a forest and you come out into a bit of farmland, you probably immediately notice a change in the climate, in the local climate. So these places are hotter and drier. And so, of course, this adds to the, as well as the climate changing globally and across wide areas, you're also getting these sorts of local areas of hot and dry conditions, which for some species is a really big problem. And so what we find if we take into account this interplay of climate change and land use is that we become much, much better able to explain what's happened. To explain the patterns that we see in how bumblebees have changed. And we get close to being able to explain around half of the patterns that we see. And that is really high in ecology. I said at the start of these results that if we can explain 10%, we're generally pretty pleased. Being able to explain nearly half is very surprising. And what we find then, if we include all of these interplay of factors in the model, is that we get close to predicting those 18% declines that we've seen over the past 115 years. And some of the patterns that we can't explain, so we've looked at what might be missing, what might be accounting for some of this grey area that we can't explain, and some of that seems to be driven by application of chemicals, which we know are bad for bumblebees, and also by some other some effects of extreme temperature that we seem not to be able to capture in our models. So, as I said at the start, one of the goals of developing this better understanding of what's happening in the past is to be able to make predictions about what might happen in the future. So once we've constructed these these models of how biodiversity is changing, and once we're satisfied that they're capturing some of the main things that are going on, then we can make predictions about what might happen. And so one thing is to say, well, what if we carry on as we are? So what we tend to refer to as business as usual. So this is a world where we continue to use a lot of fossil fuels for energy. So we get rapid climate change. We have a growing human population. We need a lot more land for growing our food. So what we find under this business as usual scenario is that we expect declines in the next 80 years, so up until the end of this century, of nearly 60% of bumblebees, which is a huge loss. We can also look at what might happen if we do things better. So in 2015 at the climate conference, an agreement was reached to try and limit global temperatures to at most 2 degrees, but hopefully 1.5 degrees. But even because of this interplay of the effects of climate change and also land use change, while things are better if we meet the Paris Climate Agreement, we're still looking at nearly doubling the losses that we've seen so far. So going to losses of around 40% on average by the end of this century. And of course, the sort of changes that we expect don't fall equally everywhere. So this is the prediction for 2100 under that business as usual scenario. And so what we find is that areas in southern Europe where we expect more extremes of temperature and of drought, that we see very, very large declines, in fact, almost complete or even complete declines in some places. And of course, this is important when we think back to that, to those foods, to those fruits and those nuts and things that we like eating. Because of course, many of these things, many of these foods are grown in these areas of southern Europe where we're expecting to see the very large declines in bumblebees. And these are the crops that we know bumblebees make a very important contribution to pollinating. So hopefully by now I've thoroughly depressed you. And so I guess in the last little bit of the talk then, I will go over some of the things that we might do. So one of the advantages of these sorts of models is that they can highlight the problem, they can highlight what's causing the problem, and they can also hopefully give us some solutions and guide us towards some of the things that we might do to reduce losses. So it's this idea that's been, one of the main things we know is really going to help is if we can reduce the level of climate change. Bumblebees are particularly sensitive to climate, particularly sensitive to these extremes of heat and drought. And so reducing climate change is one of the most important things that we can do. And there's been this idea knocking around for a few years now, this idea of climate wedges. So these are sort of a series of actions that together, if we were to do all of them, could add up to help to reduce climate change, the sorts of levels that we need. So something like the Paris Agreement at the very least. So things like more efficient transportation, more efficient generation of energy, and changes in our diets. And we've also recently been thinking about whether we might come up with a similar sort of set of biodiversity wedges, as it were. And of course, some of these relate to climate change, but we've also been thinking about some of the things that we might need in order to reduce land use change. And so this is some work that's been commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund. And of course, many of these things are the same sorts of things. So protecting natural habitats, changes in diets, reducing food waste, and so on. And what we found in some other work is that actually if we were to put together all of these things, we could go a long way towards reversing the declines in biodiversity that have been caused by habitat loss and our use of the land. And of course the other thing is that when we think about this interplay between climate change and habitat loss, one of the things that becomes clear is that species need to be able to move in order to keep up with climate change. They need to be able to move to those cooler areas further towards the poles and towards higher elevations. And so we also need to start thinking about making more connected landscapes, so making corridors of natural habitats through which species are able to move. And here in the UK, there's this really nice initiative of Bug Life, which is a charity that deals with insects in the broadest sense. And they've devised this set of what they call bee lines, which are places where they propose that corridors of natural habitat could be put in place to allow insects to move around and to prevent some of their declines. So I guess just to finish then, so I think some of the work that we're doing and that others are doing, is really highlighting the steep declines that are going on currently in animals and plants, in biodiversity in the broadest sense, and particularly in insects, and including bumblebees. And we're getting better at understanding what's driving those declines, and it seems to be quite a complex interplay of things. And climate change and habitat loss seem to be very important, and the way that they are acting against one another is driving much larger declines than we expect if we just look at climate change or we just look at habitat loss alone. And so I guess that it starts to point towards certain solutions that we might put in place in order to reduce those declines in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. We do have time for some questions, if there are any. Yeah. Actually, we're going to wait for microphones.
My bugbear is something you didn't mention, which is competition from honeybees, which is a nice middle-class habit-forming thing.
So yes, actually, in a very general way, competition between different animals and plants is something that we are not very good at capturing in these sorts of pieces of research. Actually, Richard's done some really nice work trying to understand how competition might be important in shaping the sorts of things that we see. But generally, it's quite difficult to capture those sorts of things. Yeah, but yes, it is important.
Down here and then.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. On the news, we hear things about hive failures. So, have you done any studies on? You've done work on. We hear on the news lots of stuff about hive failures. Do you understand what is happening in a hive failure?
So this is colony collapse disorder, which is this is something that's happening to honeybees. There's another sort of whole area of research into that, and diseases and parasites are very important. And we suspect that diseases and parasites are also very important in driving the sorts of declines that we're seeing in wild bees, like bumblebees. But it's again, it's not something that we have studied directly yet.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about the role of neonicotinoids. We've heard a lot about them and the damaging effect they've had on insects, and was quite relieved when we heard they were being banned a few years back in Europe. Although I read about a study recently that was saying insects were still showing severe health problems even 5 years after they'd stopped being used because they were surviving in the soil. I mean, how important do you think the role of those are, and does it partly explain the difference between Europe and North America?
Yes, they are certainly important. There have been studies that have shown that. We didn't look at neonicotinoids directly in the work that we did. It's probably part of that sort of grey area that we were unable to explain. Yes, I think it's entirely possible that is responsible for some of the differences that we see between North America and Europe. Yes. Thank you.
So I actually have two questions. My first question was related to, you mentioned that in 8 years there would be a 58% bumblebee loss. Is that based on current numbers, or is that cumulative with the losses that you already mentioned are occurring?
That's cumulative.
Okay. And my other question was, I was recently reading a paper about how the life cycles of bumblebees are basically changing, and instead of having one generation per year, they're having another generation, but there isn't any research into how that is actually going to influence their populations. Are there ways in which this can be explored through models, or?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not something that we have looked at yet. So it's another one of those things that we are not very good at capturing in the sorts of work that I do, is how species might adapt to changes. And we know that adaptation can be important. Actually, what's interesting with what we've seen with the bumblebees is that there seems to be relatively little evidence that they have successfully adapted. So, the patterns that we see are consistent with what we'd expect if they have failed to adapt. But of course, in other animals and plants, it can be important. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. In the first map, you showed sort of areas where people were reporting seeing bees, and I wondered, is this, and that sort of increase as it went through, is this more and more to do with citizen science and things like the Great British Bee Count that we have once a year here? Like, how important is citizen science and initiatives like that to you understanding what's going on?
So in a general way, citizen science is a huge asset to what we do. Most of some of what we have is what would be termed citizen science. It's mostly sort of semi-professional recorders in this case. But in other studies, citizen science has been immensely important for understanding changes.
Hi. You mentioned that the cost of losing bumblebees is in millions of dollars is quite huge, but what would be the cost of not using pesticides in the crops? It would be, I guess that it would pay off, right? Do you know the comparison between the use of no pesticides and the other one?
That's a really interesting question. No, I don't think we have the answer to that. It's a very complicated question because if we don't use pesticides, we have more diverse systems which themselves provide some control of pest populations. But also, of course, if we apply pesticides, we lose pollinators. So it's a complicated question, and we don't have an answer.
I seem to remember reading somewhere that there's 7 or 8 different species of bumblebee in the UK. Are they all suffering decline equally, or are some preferring different habitats?
That's a really good question. No, not everything is declining. Some species will benefit, of course, and but the average that we see is a decline basically, yeah.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I just wanted to ask what I, as a private person, could do to support bumblebees. Are there ways that I can change behavior or buy something less that, supports them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there are lots of things that we can do. There are some very specific things that we know are good for bumblebees, wildflower-rich habitats, and so buying food that comes from farms that are managed to be better for bumblebees is a great thing to do. Of course, managing your own land if you have any, if you have a garden, managing that to have wildflower-rich habitats. One of the possible reasons that bumblebees are sensitive to drought is that that causes a loss of wildflowers, basically, on which they rely. And then, of course, there are the big things. Anything that we can do as individuals to reduce the amount of land that is used and to reduce climate change. So those sorts of things that I had on the last slide around energy efficiency and dietary changes and so on.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I just have a quick question about, so how this climate change is affecting both the pollinator species as well as the plants? Could there be this kind of potential mismatching, and would that effect of this kind of phenological mismatching be greater than climate change on the pollinators themselves, or the effects of habitat loss, for example?
Yes, that's a really good question. Yes, that is definitely something that may be contributing, possibly in a large part, to the sorts of changes we see. There are a number of reasons why these changes in climate might be impacting pollinators and bees, and one of those is through availability of food and plants that they need.
Hi, will the HS2 routes have any effect on the bumblebees moving around?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most bumblebee species don't rely on ancient woodland of the sort that's that's going to be destroyed by HS2. Many other species do, of course. In terms of loss of, disrupting those connections, that's a good question. I think those roads and railways and things are known to be very important for mammals, which just can't cross them. I'm not so sure with insects. I suspect there is some effect, but it's not something that we've looked at.
Hi, thank you. I just wondered if you knew of any institution that keeps up-to-date phenological data that the public could access.
That's a good question. Could I ask you to email me, and I will have a think. I can't off the top of my head think who holds those data, but if you email me, I'll try and dig something out.
There was another question. Yeah, just here.
So how concerned should we be about any potential decline in other pollinating species like true wasps, and especially the European hornet? And could that European hornet perhaps enjoy legal protection in the UK like it does in Germany?
It's a really good question. We have no reason to think that the sorts of things that we are showing for bumblebees wouldn't apply equally to many other flying insects and pollinators. So without much evidence currently, yes, we should be very concerned. There is evidence that other flying insects are declining and showing steep declines, and we suspect they're probably driven by these same sorts of things. And so we expect with more climate change and more habitat loss that all flying insects groups will probably be in trouble.
I think we've time for one last question.
Is there a contingency plan for the new railway that Boris is building to put corridors in along the side of it?
I don't know that, I'm sorry. There should be, but I don't know the answer, I'm sorry.
All right, we are kind of up against the clock, so thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Tim, for a really interesting talk.